The room went silent the moment Eliza Marchmont dropped the tray of glasses. Every head in the assembly hall turned toward her. The crystal shattered across the polished floor, and for a heartbeat nobody moved. Then came the laughter. It started with a snort from a woman in a peacock blue gown, spread to her companions, and rolled outward until half the room was smiling behind gloved hands. Eliza stood frozen, her face burning, her thin fingers trembling at her sides. She had felt the dizziness coming for the last few minutes, the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever a room grew too warm and too crowded. She had tried to fight it, tried to steady her breath the way she always did, but her body had betrayed her in front of everyone who mattered in the county. "There she goes again," someone murmured, just loud enough to be heard. "The delicate Miss Marchmont. One wonders how she survives a single day without fainting into her soup." Eliza bent down and began gathering the broken glass with bare hands, ignoring the sharp edges pressing into her fingers. She would not cry. She had promised herself years ago that she would never give this room the satisfaction of her tears. A servant rushed to help her, but Eliza waved him off and finished the task herself, glass by glass, while the orchestra resumed and the dancing continued around her as though she were nothing more than a piece of furniture that had briefly caused an inconvenience. She left the assembly hall an hour later, walking the 2 miles home alone because she could not afford a carriage and would not ask her cousin for one. The night air was cold against her flushed cheeks. Above her, the stars were sharp and clear, and she found herself wishing, not for the first time, that she had been born into a life where her mind mattered more than her body. Because Eliza's mind was the one thing nobody in that ballroom understood. For 3 years, since her father's death, she had kept their small farm from ruin, using nothing but a worn ledger book, a stub of pencil, and hours spent awake long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. Her father had taught her figures before he taught her to dance, though he had warned her never to speak of it outside their walls. A woman who understood accounts better than the men around her, he used to say, was a woman who made enemies before she made friends. She had listened to him. She had hidden her gift the way other women hid scars, and instead let the county believe what it wished to believe, that she was frail, awkward, unremarkable, a girl who would likely never marry, and would spend her days as a burden upon whichever relation was unlucky enough to house her. Eliza reached the small cottage she shared with her aunt just past midnight. She lit a single candle in the kitchen, and pulled her father's old ledger from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. She opened it not because there was any pressing figure to check, but because the columns of neat numbers were the only thing in her life that never laughed at her. Numbers did not care if her hands shook. Numbers did not care that she sometimes could not catch her breath in a crowded room. Numbers simply were, and she found comfort in their honesty. She fell asleep at the table an hour later, her cheek resting against the open pages. Her aunt found her there before dawn and shook her gently awake, scolding her in the soft, worried way she always did when she caught Eliza working over the ledger long past a sensible hour. Margaret Marchmont was a kind woman, but she carried her own quiet fears about her niece's future. She had watched Eliza grow from a sickly child into a guarded young woman who trusted numbers more than people, and she often wondered aloud what would become of her once she herself was gone. "You cannot spend your whole life bent over your father's old book," her aunt said that morning, setting a plate of bread and butter in front of her. "The Hartleys are hosting another gathering next month. You should go. You should try, just once, to let people see something other than what happened last night." Eliza only smiled faintly and said nothing. She had tried, more times than she could count, to be the kind of woman the county admired. She had practiced smiling in mirrors, practiced steady breathing before entering crowded rooms, practiced holding a teacup without letting it rattle against its saucer. None of it mattered. The moment her body faltered, even slightly, the room remembered only her weakness and forgot every effort she had made to overcome it. What the village did not know, and what Eliza rarely allowed herself to dwell upon, was the truth behind her fragile constitution. As a child, she had suffered a long illness that left her lungs weaker than most, prone to sudden breathlessness in heat or crowds or moments of great strain. Her father, rather than treating her as broken, had treated her as capable of more than her body suggested. While other girls learned embroidery, Eliza learned how to balance columns of figures late into the evening beside her father's chair, absorbing his quiet lessons on debts, interest, and the slow arithmetic of a struggling farm kept alive through careful management rather than luck. It was through those long evenings that she discovered something rare within herself, a mind that moved through numbers the way other minds move through familiar streets, without hesitation, without confusion, always finding the shortest path to the truth, hidden inside a column of figures. Her father used to say she had a gift most men trained for decades never developed, and he had made her promise, more than once, to guard that gift carefully, in a world unlikely to forgive a woman for possessing it. She kept that promise even after his death, even as the farm's small profits kept their household from ruin while she let the village believe she survived on charity and good fortune alone. The next morning brought news that swept through the village faster than any fire. Nathaniel Ashworth had arrived. Eliza heard it first from the baker's wife, who nearly dropped a tray of bread in her excitement to spread the story. Ashworth was the wealthiest landowner in 3 counties, master of an estate so vast that its borders touched 4 separate parishes. He rarely visited this part of the country, preferring to manage his affairs from London or from his grander properties further north, but here he was, riding through the village at dawn with a face like a man carrying the weight of a collapsing world on his shoulders. Nobody knew why he had come. The rumors multiplied by the hour. Some said he had come to inspect a smaller property he owned nearby. Others whispered that his fortune, long believed unshakable, had begun to crack, though nobody could say how or why a man so wealthy could possibly be in any danger. Eliza paid the gossip little mind at first. Men like Nathaniel Ashworth did not exist in the same world as women like her. She had seen him only once before, years ago, from a distance at a country fair. A tall figure on a black horse, who had not so much as glanced in the direction of the farmers and their daughters gathered to watch the festivities. She spent that day as she spent every other, tending to the small vegetable garden behind the cottage and helping her aunt mend linens for a few extra coins. It was quiet, unremarkable work, and she was grateful for it. The garden did not laugh at her. The needle and thread did not whisper behind her back. It was near dusk when she noticed a rider pause at the end of the lane. He sat still on his horse for a long moment, studying the small cottage, as though trying to decide whether he had come to the right place. Eliza straightened from where she knelt among the cabbages, brushing dirt from her hands, and felt a strange tightness rise in her chest that had nothing to do with her usual weakness. The rider dismounted and walked toward the low fence, separating the garden from the lane. Up close, he was younger than she expected, though his eyes carried the tired weight of a much older man. His coat was well made but slightly rumpled, as though he had ridden a great distance without pausing to rest. There was no arrogance in his posture, only a kind of quiet, controlled desperation that Eliza recognized immediately, because she had worn that same expression more times than she could count. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "I am looking for a Miss Marchmont. I was told she keeps exceptional accounts." Eliza's breath caught. Nobody outside her own household was supposed to know that. "I do not know what you mean, sir," she said carefully, though her voice betrayed the smallest tremor. The man studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze sharpened, as though he had expected exactly this kind of denial, and had already prepared himself for it. "I mean no harm," he said. "I am Nathaniel Ashworth. I have a matter of great urgency, and I have been told, by more than one person in this village, that you are the only one clever enough with figures to help me understand it." Eliza's mind raced through every possible reason a man of his standing would seek out a woman like her, and none of them made sense. She thought of the ledger hidden beneath the floorboard, the years of careful secrecy, the promise she had made to her father. "I keep my father's old accounts," she said finally, "nothing more." "Then you keep them well enough that people speak of it 3 villages over," Nathaniel said. "I did not come here for idle conversation, Miss Marchmont. My estate is failing, and I do not yet understand why. I need someone I can trust to look at the numbers with fresh eyes, someone with no stake in protecting the men who currently manage my affairs." Eliza stared at him, this stranger standing at her garden fence with an offer that could either save her from a lifetime of being underestimated or expose her to a humiliation far greater than any dropped tray of glasses could ever cause. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "There are accountants in London, men with proper training and proper letters after their names." "Because those men already failed me," Nathaniel said, his voice tightening. "And because I no longer trust anyone whose name is already written into my ledgers." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of turned earth and coming rain. Somewhere behind her, Eliza heard her aunt calling her in for supper, unaware that the entire shape of her niece's life was about to change at the garden fence. Eliza looked down at her soil-stained hands, then back up at the tired, desperate man before her. "I will need to see the ledgers myself," she said, "before I promise anything at all." For the first time since he had arrived, something that might have been relief passed across Nathaniel Ashworth's face. "Tomorrow, then," he said, "at first light." He turned and mounted his horse without another word, riding off into the gathering dusk, leaving Eliza standing alone at the fence with her heart pounding harder than it ever had in any crowded ballroom. She did not yet know that within a fortnight her name would no longer be spoken with mockery, but she also did not know how close she would come to losing everything before the truth finally came to light. Eliza did not sleep at all that night. She sat by the window watching the lane for any sign that Nathaniel Ashworth might return before morning, half convinced the entire encounter had been some strange dream brought on by exhaustion and humiliation. But when the first gray light touched the fields, she heard the sound of hooves again, steady and unhurried, and she knew the dream had been real. She met him at the fence, wrapped in her cloak against the morning chill, her father's ledger clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. "You came," Nathaniel said, and there was something almost boyish in his relief, a crack in the composed exterior he had worn the evening before. "I said I would look at your accounts," Eliza replied. "I did not say I would agree to anything more." He nodded, accepting the boundary without argument, and gestured toward a modest carriage waiting further down the lane. "Then let us begin with looking." The ride to Ashworth Hall took the better part of an hour, and Eliza spent most of it in silence, watching the countryside change from familiar farmland into grander, unfamiliar territory. Stone walls gave way to iron gates, narrow lanes widened into gravel drives lined with ancient oaks, and eventually the house itself came into view, a sprawling structure of pale stone that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. She had never seen anything so large in her life. Yet as they drew closer, she noticed details that told a different story than the grandeur suggested. Ivy had been allowed to creep too far up the west wing, cracking the stonework beneath it. Several windows stood shuttered, as though entire portions of the house had been closed off to save on candles and coal. A groundskeeper's cottage near the entrance sat visibly empty, its garden overgrown with weeds. Nathaniel noticed her studying the house and said nothing, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Inside, he led her not to a grand drawing room, but to a smaller study near the back of the house, its shelves crowded with ledgers, correspondence, and stacks of unopened letters that looked as though they had been avoided rather than merely delayed. A thin, nervous-looking man rose from behind the desk as they entered, his eyes flicking with obvious discomfort between Nathaniel and Eliza. "This is Edmund Caro," Nathaniel said, "my cousin, and until recently, the man responsible for managing the estate's daily accounts." "Until recently?" Eliza asked. "I have decided a fresh perspective is needed," Nathaniel said carefully, "given how far matters have fallen despite Edmund's assurances that all was well." Edmund's smile did not reach his eyes. "I hardly think a village girl with a farmer's ledger is the fresh perspective this estate requires, cousin. No offense intended, of course, Miss Marchmont." "None taken," Eliza said evenly, though she felt the familiar sting of being dismissed before she had even opened a single book. "I imagine we shall discover soon enough whether my perspective proves useful." Nathaniel gestured toward the desk, now piled high with ledgers spanning what appeared to be several years. "These are the estate's complete records. Rents collected, wages paid, harvests sold, debts owed. I confess I understand perhaps a third of what is written here, and even that third troubles me greatly." Eliza set her father's ledger aside and pulled the first of Nathaniel's books toward her, opening it slowly, almost reverently, the way another woman might open a letter from someone she loved. The columns were far more complex than anything she had managed on the farm, filled with unfamiliar terms and larger sums than she had ever handled, but the underlying logic remained the same. Numbers were numbers, whether they concerned a single struggling farm or an estate spanning 4 parishes. She spent the first hour simply reading, tracing figures with her finger, occasionally pausing to reference an earlier page or cross-check a sum against another entry. Nathaniel watched her with barely concealed impatience, while Edmund hovered near the doorway, finding excuses to remain in the room rather than attend to whatever business he claimed awaited him elsewhere. "You will find everything in order," Edmund said at one point, his voice a touch too loud for the quiet room. "The estate has simply suffered from poor harvests these last 2 years, nothing more sinister than bad weather and bad luck." Eliza did not look up from the page in front of her. "Bad weather does not usually explain why rents collected in the spring quarter of 2 years ago do not match the sum recorded as received by the estate's bank." The room went silent. Edmund's face paled slightly before recovering into a strained laugh. "A clerical error, surely. These books pass through many hands." "Perhaps," Eliza said, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. "I should like to examine the original rent collection records to be certain." "Those records are kept separately," Edmund said quickly. "I shall have to locate them." "Please do," Nathaniel said, his voice suddenly sharper than before, and Eliza noticed the way his attention had shifted entirely onto his cousin, as though seeing him for the first time in a new and less forgiving light. Edmund excused himself from the room with visible relief, and once the door closed behind him, Nathaniel exhaled slowly and rubbed a hand across his tired eyes. "You found something already," he said. It was not a question. "I found a discrepancy," Eliza corrected. "It may be nothing. Ledgers often contain small errors that mean very little, but it may also be something worth understanding fully before we assume the worst. How long will you need?" Eliza considered the mountain of books before her, then looked at the man across the desk, whose entire fortune and future seemed to rest upon the outcome of her work. She thought of her father's warning about women who understood accounts better than the men around them, and how such women made enemies before they made friends. She thought of the assembly hall, the shattered glass, the laughter that still echoed faintly in her memory. She thought, too, of the quiet satisfaction she felt now, surrounded by numbers that finally mattered to someone other than herself. "Weeks, perhaps," she said. "If you will permit me to work uninterrupted, and if you can ensure I have access to every record this estate possesses, not merely the ones your cousin chooses to hand me." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from desperation into something closer to respect. "You shall have whatever you need, Miss Marchmont. I will personally see to it." Over the following days, Eliza returned to Ashworth Hall each morning, working in the small study until the light faded each evening. Word of her visit spread quickly through the village, exactly as she had feared it might. She overheard whispers at the market, saw the sideways glances from women who had once laughed at her fainting spells and now seemed uncertain what to make of her sudden association with the wealthiest man in the county. One afternoon, while waiting for a servant to bring a requested set of records from the estate's archive room, Eliza wandered into the long gallery that ran along the eastern side of the house. Portraits of generations of Ashworths lined the walls, stern faces staring down from gilded frames, and she found herself studying them with quiet curiosity, wondering what pressures and expectations each of them had carried in their turn. "My grandfather," Nathaniel said, appearing beside her and nodding toward a portrait of a broad-shouldered man with a hard, unsmiling mouth. "He built most of what you see beyond these walls. My father expanded it further, though he cared little for the details of managing it, and left most decisions to men he trusted, sometimes too readily." "And you?" Eliza asked. "What do you intend to build?" Nathaniel considered the question longer than she expected. "I used to believe I would simply preserve what was given to me. Now I find myself wondering whether preservation alone is enough, or whether an estate, like anything else, must be tended carefully by someone willing to look closely at what others prefer to ignore." Eliza glanced at him, sensing the deeper meaning beneath his words, though neither of them spoke it aloud. "Tending closely requires trusting the person doing the tending," she said instead. "That trust must be earned, not simply assumed because of a name or a title." "You have earned a great deal of it already, Miss Marchmont," Nathaniel said quietly, and for a moment their eyes met and held, the portraits above them silent witnesses to something neither was yet prepared to name. The servant's return with the requested ledgers broke the moment, and Eliza returned to her work with her cheeks faintly warm, telling herself firmly that she had imagined any particular weight behind his words. Her aunt, for her part, grew increasingly anxious about the arrangement, worried more for Eliza's reputation than for her well-being. "People will talk," Margaret warned one evening, watching Eliza prepare for another early departure. "A young woman spending so many hours alone in a gentleman's house, however respectable the reason, will not go unremarked." "I am there to examine his accounts, Aunt, nothing more," Eliza said, though even she could not deny the strange warmth she felt whenever Nathaniel entered the study to check on her progress, or the way his tired eyes seemed to soften slightly whenever she explained some new discovery hidden within his books. She told herself it meant nothing. He was a landowner desperate to save his estate, and she was merely the tool he had found to accomplish that task. Nothing more could exist between them, not with the vast gulf of station separating her small cottage from his sprawling halls. Yet each day, as she uncovered another thread of the estate's unraveling finances, she found herself looking forward to his visits to the study more than she cared to admit. He asked thoughtful questions about her findings, listened carefully to her explanations, and never once treated her the way the assembly hall had, as something fragile and slightly ridiculous. He treated her, for the first time in longer than she could remember, as though her mind mattered more than her weaknesses. By the end of the second week, Eliza had identified a pattern too consistent to be accidental. Certain rents, particularly from the estate's furthest and least visited properties, showed a steady and unexplained gap between what tenants recorded paying and what the estate's accounts recorded receiving. The gaps were small enough to avoid immediate notice, but consistent enough, over several years, to account for a significant portion of the estate's mounting troubles. She brought her findings to Nathaniel late one evening, spreading the relevant pages across his desk, and walking him through each discrepancy with careful, patient precision. "Someone has been diverting funds," she said finally. "Not through any single dramatic theft, but through years of small, careful adjustments that would only become visible to someone willing to compare every record against every other record, exactly as your cousin assured you was unnecessary." Nathaniel stared at the pages for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You believe it is Edmund." "I believe the records point toward whoever controlled the collection and recording of these particular rents," Eliza said carefully. "I make no accusation beyond what the numbers themselves suggest." "But you believe it," Nathaniel pressed. Eliza met his gaze steadily. "I believe the numbers rarely lie, even when the people who record them do." Nathaniel sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, the weight of the discovery settling visibly across his shoulders. "Edmund is family. He has managed this estate since my father's death. I trusted him completely." "I understand this is difficult to hear," Eliza said, softening her tone. "I do not offer this conclusion lightly, and I would advise caution before any confrontation. We have found a pattern, not yet a confession. If your cousin is indeed responsible, he will not surrender easily, and he may attempt to protect himself by any means available to him." Nathaniel looked up at her then, and something in his gaze held a gratitude far deeper than mere relief at solving a financial puzzle. "You have done in 2 weeks what men with far greater training could not accomplish in months. I do not know how to properly thank you, Miss Marchmont." "You need not thank me," Eliza said, though warmth spread through her chest at his words. "You need only be careful. Whoever has done this will not welcome being found out." Eliza gathered her papers slowly that evening, unaware of what had just passed, unseen beyond the study door. She lingered a moment longer than necessary, watching Nathaniel stare into the dying fire, his shoulders carrying the weight of a betrayal he had not yet fully accepted as true. "What will you do?" she asked softly, "once we know for certain?" "I do not know," Nathaniel admitted. "Edmund is the only family I have left in this county. My mother's health will not survive the scandal of a public accusation against her nephew, not without proof beyond any possible doubt." "Then we will find proof beyond doubt," Eliza said, with more confidence than she entirely felt. "Numbers left no ambiguity when I checked them. Somewhere in these records lies the exact trail of every diverted shilling, and I intend to find it." Nathaniel looked at her then with an expression she could not quite name, something between admiration and quiet disbelief that fate had delivered him, in his darkest hour, a woman the county had spent years dismissing as fragile and unremarkable. "You are not at all what people say of you, Miss Marchmont," he said. "People rarely trouble themselves to look closely enough to know the truth," Eliza replied, gathering her cloak against the evening chill. "It is easier to laugh at what appears weak than to wonder what strength might be hidden beneath it." She left Ashworth Hall that night with her mind full of figures and possibilities, entirely unaware of the danger already gathering against her in the shadows of the very house she had begun, despite every warning from her own good sense, to feel almost at home within. Neither of them noticed the study door easing shut in the corridor outside, nor the soft, retreating footsteps that carried Edmund Carrow away from the room, his face tight with fury and fear in equal measure, already turning over in his mind exactly what he intended to do about the quiet farm girl who had uncovered in weeks what he had spent years carefully hiding. The archive room smelled of dust and old paper, and Eliza had spent 3 straight days buried within it, searching for the one record that would turn suspicion into certainty. She had narrowed the pattern to 5 specific properties, all located at the estate's furthest boundaries, all managed through a single collection agent who reported directly to Edmund rather than to the estate's central office. The rents from these properties consistently arrived short, always by amounts small enough to escape casual notice, always explained away in the ledgers with vague notations about weather, damaged crops, or tenant hardship. What she needed now was proof that the shortfalls were deliberate rather than genuine, and that meant finding the original receipts the tenants themselves had been given upon payment, receipts that would show the true amount collected before any figure was later altered in the estate's official books. "You look as though you have not slept in days," Nathaniel said, appearing in the doorway with 2 cups of tea balanced carefully in his hands. "I have not," Eliza admitted, accepting the cup gratefully, "but I believe I am close to something." She spread several documents across the table, comparing dates and signatures with the careful precision that had become second nature to her. "Here," she said finally, pointing to a receipt dated some 18 months earlier. This tenant, a farmer named Godwin, paid his full quarterly rent in coin, as recorded on this receipt bearing his own mark. Yet the estate's ledger records receiving only 2/3 of that sum from the collection agent who visited him. Nathaniel leaned closer, studying the two documents side by side. The receipt could be forged. It could, Eliza agreed. Which is why I intend to speak with the tenant himself, if you will permit it. A man's own memory of handing over his hard-earned coin is difficult to falsify convincingly, particularly if he has no reason to lie on behalf of a farm girl he has never met. Nathaniel's expression grew troubled. If Edmund learns you intend to question his tenants directly, he will know exactly what we suspect. Then we must be careful how we approach it, Eliza said. Perhaps a visit framed as ordinary estate business, nothing more than a new steward becoming familiar with the tenants under his care. A new steward, Nathaniel repeated slowly, studying her with an unreadable expression. Is that a role you would be willing to accept, Miss Marchmont? Formally, I mean, not merely as a temporary favor. Eliza's breath caught. You cannot be serious. A woman managing an estate's accounts, officially, in place of a man with your cousin's standing, the county would never accept it. The county accepted my cousin's mismanagement for years without question, Nathaniel said, his voice hardening slightly. I find I care rather less what the county accepts and rather more about who has actually earned my trust. Eliza did not answer immediately, torn between the fierce pride that rose in her chest at his words and the practical fear of what such a position would mean for her already fragile reputation. She thought of her father's warning once more, echoing quietly in the back of her mind, and wondered whether accepting such a role would only confirm every unkind thing the village had ever whispered about her. Let us find the truth first, she said finally. We can discuss positions and titles once Edmund's guilt, or his innocence, stands beyond question. Nathaniel nodded, accepting her caution, though something in his eyes suggested the offer had not been made lightly, nor would it be easily withdrawn. They visited the tenant farmer Godwin 2 days later, traveling in a plain cart rather than Nathaniel's usual carriage to avoid drawing unwanted attention. Godwin proved a weathered, careful man, initially wary of any questions concerning his rent payments, until Nathaniel assured him plainly that no fault or blame would fall upon any tenant for answering honestly. I paid the full sum, Godwin said firmly, once his wariness had eased. Every shilling of it, same as always, straight into the collection agent's own hand. I remember distinctly, because it took nearly everything we had put by that quarter, and my wife fretted over it for a week after. And the agent gave you this receipt? Eliza asked, showing him the document she had found in the archive. Godwin squinted at the paper, then nodded firmly. That is my mark, right enough. I cannot read myself, but I know my own mark when I see it. Made it 1,000 times over the years. Eliza thanked him warmly and promised the matter would be looked into further, careful to reveal nothing of her deeper suspicions. As they rode back toward Ashworth Hall, she felt the pieces of the puzzle settling firmly into place. He collected the full amount and recorded less than what he received, she said. The discrepancy between what tenants actually paid and what appears in the official books was pocketed somewhere between collection and recording, and given that your cousin personally reviewed and approved every entry in these ledgers, it is difficult to imagine such a consistent pattern occurring without his direct knowledge. Or his direct instruction, Nathaniel said grimly. The second tenant they visited was a widow named Marjorie Colt, who farmed a modest plot at the estate's northern edge, with the help of her 2 grown sons. She received them with cautious hospitality, offering weak tea and stale biscuits with the pride of a woman determined not to appear as poor as her circumstances suggested. I remember the collection well enough, she said, once Nathaniel had explained their purpose in gentle, unthreatening terms. It was a hard quarter, what with the early frost taking half our turnips, but we paid in full regardless. My eldest son sold his own pocket watch to make up the difference, a gift from his late father, and I have not forgiven myself for allowing it since. Eliza's chest tightened at the woman's words, the human cost behind the numbers becoming suddenly, painfully real. She had spent weeks thinking of the discrepancy as an abstract puzzle, columns and sums waiting to be balanced. Standing now in Marjorie Colt's modest kitchen, she understood for the first time the true weight of what Edmund's deception had cost, not merely in shillings, but in sacrificed treasures and sleepless nights among people who could least afford either. Your son's watch, Eliza said quietly. Do you recall who received it, and whether any acknowledgement was given for its value against the rent owed? Marjorie nodded slowly, some of her caution easing at the gentleness in Eliza's voice. The same agent as always, wrote it down himself, though I never saw what became of that writing afterward. Why do you ask, miss? Has something gone wrong with our account? Nothing that concerns you or your sons, Nathaniel assured her firmly. I am simply ensuring every tenant on this estate has been treated fairly, something I regret to say I have not overseen as closely as I ought these past years. They left the widow's farm with yet another piece of damning evidence, and Eliza found herself unusually quiet on the ride back, turning Marjorie Colt's words over in her mind. You are troubled, Nathaniel observed, watching her carefully from across the small cart. I had thought of this as a matter of missing figures, Eliza admitted, numbers to be traced and corrected. I had not fully considered what those missing figures meant to the people who earned them. A pocket watch, sold in desperation, simply to satisfy a debt that had already been paid in full through honest coin. It is a cruelty I had not properly weighed until now. Then we shall weigh it properly going forward, Nathaniel said, his voice firm with new resolve. Whatever proof we gather, I intend to see every tenant made whole, whatever the eventual cost to my own family's name. The third tenant they visited, a quiet elderly man named Aldous Fenn, confirmed the pattern once more, though he offered little beyond a resigned shrug when asked whether he had considered raising the matter with the estate directly. Who would believe an old farmer's word against a gentleman's ledger? He said simply, better to pay twice than to be thrown off the land I have worked my whole life for, daring to make such an accusation. His words lingered with Eliza long after they had departed, a stark reminder of exactly why Edmund's scheme had gone unnoticed for so long. It was not cleverness alone that had protected him, but the quiet, powerless silence of people who had learned, through long experience, that speaking truth against those above them rarely ended well for those without standing to defend themselves. By the end of the week, Eliza had assembled a case built not merely on discrepancies in a ledger, but on the direct testimony of honest men and women, with no reason to lie, and every reason, given their circumstances, to have remained silent instead. Yet even as the evidence mounted, word of their visits inevitably reached the village, and with it came a fresh wave of gossip, sharper and more damaging than anything Eliza had faced before. They say she rides about the countryside with him now, unchaperoned, visiting farmers at all hours. She overheard one afternoon at the market, two women deliberately raising their voices just enough to ensure she caught every word. What respectable woman behaves so boldly, whatever the excuse given for it? Perhaps she has set her sights higher than any of us imagined, the other replied, with a knowing laugh, though I cannot think what a man of his standing could possibly want with someone so plain and sickly, beyond perhaps taking advantage of her low position for his own amusement. Eliza walked past them without responding, her chin held high despite the familiar burning humiliation rising in her chest. She had grown accustomed to being laughed at for her weakness. She had not yet grown accustomed to being whispered about for a closeness she herself barely understood, torn as she was between professional necessity and feelings she refused to examine too closely. That evening, she found Nathaniel waiting for her at the garden fence, an unusual visit given the late hour. You should not have come, she said, though not unkindly. The village already talks enough without your carriage sitting outside my aunt's cottage after dark. I heard what was said of you at the market today, Nathaniel replied. I came to apologize. I never intended my request for your help to bring such difficulty upon you. You need not apologize for the small-mindedness of people who have always preferred gossip to truth, Eliza said. I have endured their laughter my entire life. I can endure a little more of it now, particularly if the outcome proves worthwhile. And if it does not, Nathaniel asked quietly, if Edmund escapes consequence, and you are left only with a ruined reputation, and nothing gained in exchange? Eliza considered the question seriously before answering. Then at least I will have spent these weeks doing work that mattered, rather than sitting quietly at the edge of ballrooms waiting to be noticed and dismissed in equal measure. That alone is worth more to me than you might imagine. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment in the fading light, something warm and unguarded passing across his usually careful expression. I do not think, Miss Marchmont, that I have ever met anyone quite like you. You have simply never troubled yourself to look closely at women like me before, Eliza said, though her voice softened as she said it, and neither of them moved away from the fence for a long while afterward, the evening settling comfortably around them despite everything working against such comfort existing at all. The following morning brought an unwelcome surprise. Edmund appeared at Ashworth Hall earlier than usual, his manner brisk and falsely cheerful, carrying with him a stack of what he claimed were the missing collection records Eliza had requested weeks earlier. I apologize for the delay, he said, setting the papers before her with exaggerated politeness. These old records take considerable searching to locate properly. Eliza examined the pages carefully. and her stomach tightened as she realized immediately that something was wrong. The figures recorded here did not match the receipts she had already gathered from the tenants themselves. Instead, they showed amounts precisely matching the estate's official ledgers, conveniently eliminating any discrepancy she had previously identified. "These appear to be newly written," she said carefully, studying the ink, which seemed fresher than documents supposedly years old, rather more recently than the dates suggest. Edmund's smile faltered only slightly. "I assure you, Miss Marchmont, those records are entirely authentic. Perhaps your farmer's daughter eyes are simply unaccustomed to properly aged paper." The insult was deliberate, and Eliza felt Nathaniel stiffen beside her, though she raised a hand slightly, silently asking him not to intervene on her behalf. "Perhaps," she said evenly, meeting Edmund's gaze without flinching, "though I have spent considerable time recently among farmers, Mr. Caro, and I find their memories of their own hard-earned coin remarkably difficult to forge, however skillfully a document might be aged or altered." Something flickered behind Edmund's eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared, but Eliza recognized it clearly enough. It was the look of a man realizing, for the first time, that the quiet woman he had dismissed so easily might prove far more dangerous to him than he had ever anticipated. "I have business elsewhere," Edmund said abruptly, gathering his forged papers and departing the study without further pleasantries, though not before shooting Eliza a final glance, sharp enough to carry a warning she understood perfectly well, even unspoken. Once he had gone, Nathaniel turned to her with obvious concern. "You believe those records were forged specifically to counter what we found? I believe your cousin has realized precisely how close we have come to exposing him," Eliza said, "and I believe a man cornered in such a manner rarely surrenders quietly. We should expect him to act, and soon, in whatever way he believes will best protect himself." She was right to worry. Neither of them yet understood how far Edmund Caro was prepared to go, nor how quickly the ground beneath Eliza's newfound purpose was about to shift entirely against her. That night, as Eliza walked the familiar path home from Ashworth Hall, she noticed a figure watching her from the shadow of the tree line bordering the lane, gone the instant she turned to look more directly. She quickened her pace, telling herself it was merely a trick of the fading light and her own exhausted mind, though the uneasy feeling followed her all the way to her aunt's door and lingered long after she had bolted it firmly behind her. Inside, she found her aunt waiting up despite the late hour, a single candle burning low on the kitchen table. "You look pale, even for you," Margaret said, studying her niece's face with the sharp attention only an aunt who had raised a fragile child could possess. "Has something happened?" Eliza considered how much to share, mindful of her aunt's fragile nerves and the very real danger she now suspected surrounded her work at Ashworth Hall. "Nothing beyond a long day," she said finally, choosing to spare her aunt the full weight of her suspicions. "Mr. Ashworth's accounts prove more complicated than either of us first believed." Margaret studied her a moment longer, clearly unconvinced but wise enough not to press further. "Just be careful, my dear. Wealthy men's troubles have a way of becoming very ordinary women's troubles, if we are not careful how closely we stand beside them." "I am only there to balance his books, Aunt," Eliza said, though the words felt thinner in her own mouth than they had a fortnight earlier. "Balancing books rarely puts that particular color in a young woman's cheeks," Margaret said, with the faintest knowing smile, before rising to bank the fire for the night and leaving Eliza alone with her thoughts, and the ledger pages spread once more across the table. Eliza sat long after her aunt had retired, staring at the neat columns of figures that had once brought her such simple comfort. Tonight they offered no comfort at all, only the growing certainty that she stood at the edge of something far larger and more dangerous than a simple accounting error, something that had already cost honest families their treasures and their peace, and something that a desperate, cornered man might yet be willing to do a great deal to protect. She thought of the figure in the shadows, of Edmund's sharp, warning glance as he left the study, of the widow's sold pocket watch, and the old farmer's resigned silence. Each piece settled heavily upon her, and for the first time since agreeing to help Nathaniel, she allowed herself to wonder seriously whether she had walked willingly into far more danger than any dropped tray of glasses had ever threatened her with. Yet even as the fear settled over her, something steadier remained beneath it, a quiet resolve she recognized from every long night spent over her father's ledger, refusing to let a difficult problem defeat her, simply because it had grown larger and more frightening than expected. She had come too far now to retreat, and whatever Edmund Caro intended, she found herself unwilling to abandon either the truth she had uncovered or the man who had trusted her enough to seek it out in the first place. The constable arrived at Ashworth Hall 3 days later, and Eliza knew the moment she saw his grim expression that whatever Edmund had planned had finally been set into motion. Miss Marchmont, the constable said, his tone carefully formal, I have been asked to investigate a serious accusation concerning missing funds from this estate's accounts. I understand you have had considerable access to those accounts these past weeks. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. I have been assisting Mr. Ashworth in reviewing his records, yes. What exactly is being suggested? That certain sums have gone missing since your involvement began, the constable said, consulting a paper in his hand. And that a document has come into evidence bearing your signature, authorizing a transfer of funds to an account outside this estate's ownership. That is impossible, Eliza said, her voice rising despite her effort to remain composed. I have never signed any such document. I have never had authority to transfer funds at all. Nathaniel, who had arrived moments earlier at the sound of raised voices, stepped forward immediately. Whatever accusation has been made, I can assure you it is entirely without merit. Miss Marchmont has done nothing but uncover irregularities that predate her involvement by years. I understand your confidence in the lady, sir, the constable said carefully, but the document itself appears quite convincing, and given the seriousness of the sum involved, I am obligated to investigate fully before dismissing the accusation outright. Eliza's hands trembled as the constable produced the document in question, a formal letter authorizing the transfer of a considerable sum to an account she had never heard of, bearing at its bottom a signature that looked, at a careless glance, remarkably like her own. I did not write this, she said, studying the forged signature with growing horror. The hand is close, but not precise. Look here, at the way the letters connect. I form my capital letters quite differently. Forgeries are rarely perfect to the trained eye, Miss Marchmont, the constable said, not unkindly, but they need only convince a magistrate unfamiliar with your particular hand to cause considerable trouble for you. That evening, alone in the small study where she had spent so many hopeful hours, Eliza sat across from Nathaniel while the constable gathered his papers to leave. Neither of them spoke for a long moment after the door closed behind him. I do not understand how a forged document could appear so quickly, so convincingly, Nathaniel said finally, pacing before the cold hearth. Edmund must have prepared this well in advance, anticipating exactly this outcome should our investigation draw too close. A man who has spent years quietly diverting funds does not do so without also preparing his defenses, Eliza said, though her own voice sounded hollow to her ears, exhaustion and fear beginning to wear through her usual composure. I suspect he began preparing the moment he realized I had noticed the first discrepancy in the rent collections. Then he has been planning my ruin and yours for weeks while pretending nothing but cooperation, Nathaniel said bitterly. I trusted him with everything, Eliza. My father trusted him, and he has repaid that trust by attempting to destroy the one person capable of exposing him. Eliza wanted, more than anything, to reach across the space between them and offer some comfort, but propriety, and her own uncertain place within his life held her firmly in check. We shall prove the forgery, she said instead, with more confidence than she entirely felt. The truth does not simply vanish because someone clever has tried to bury it beneath a false signature. Nathaniel looked at her then with an expression of such genuine anguish that it nearly undid her careful composure entirely. I fear I have brought this trouble upon you through my own desperation to save this estate. If any harm comes to your reputation through my actions, I shall never forgive myself. You did not forge that document, Nathaniel, Eliza said softly, using his given name for the first time, a small act of intimacy that seemed to steady them both in the moment. Whatever consequence follows, it belongs to the man who created it, not to either of us who sought only the truth. Word of the accusation spread through Ashworth Hall's staff within hours, and from there into the village by the following morning, growing more exaggerated with each retelling. By the time Eliza walked to the market that afternoon, desperate for some ordinary task to distract her racing thoughts, she found herself met with open stares and whispered conversations that fell silent whenever she drew near. They say she has been stealing from him for weeks, she overheard one woman murmur to another near the baker's stall, hiding behind all that talk of clever accounts, when really she was simply lining her own pockets while pretending to help him. I always suspected there was something calculating beneath that quiet manner, the other replied. Poor Mr. Ashworth, taken in so completely by a scheming little farm girl. Eliza walked home that day with her chin held as high as she could manage, though the humiliation cut far deeper than any laughter over a dropped tray of glasses ever had. That mockery, at least, had been born of genuine weakness she could not control. This accusation struck at the very thing she had always been most proud of, the honesty and precision of her work, the one part of herself she had never allowed anyone to diminish. She found Nathaniel waiting at her aunt's cottage that evening, his expression grave. Edmund has been busy, he said without preamble. He has spoken to several members of the local gentry, suggesting quite openly that I have been deceived by a clever and ambitious woman who saw an opportunity in my troubles and seized it without conscience. And do you believe him? Eliza asked quietly, bracing herself for an answer she feared more than she cared to admit. Of course not, Nathaniel said immediately, his voice firm, but I must proceed carefully. The magistrate has scheduled a formal hearing to examine the evidence, and until that hearing concludes, propriety demands I distance myself somewhat from your involvement in the estate's affairs, for both our sakes. Eliza felt something cold settle in her chest, despite understanding the practical necessity of his words. You wish me to stay away from Ashworth Hall. I wish for none of this, Nathaniel said, but I have consulted with my solicitor, and he advises strongly against any appearance of continued closeness between us until the accusation has been properly cleared. I am sorry, Eliza. I do not say this because I doubt you. It was the first time he had used her given name, and despite everything, she noticed it immediately. A small, painful intimacy arriving at precisely the wrong moment to offer any real comfort. I understand, she said, though her voice caught slightly. I have managed on my own before. I shall manage now. Nathaniel hesitated at the fence, clearly wanting to say more, before finally simply nodding and returning to his waiting carriage, leaving Eliza alone once more, with the growing certainty that everything she had worked to build over the past weeks was collapsing around her precisely as Edmund had intended. The following days passed in a haze of isolation and dread. Eliza's aunt, though sympathetic, grew increasingly fearful of the scandal attached to their household, and even the small kindnesses of neighbors who had once tolerated her quiet presence now seemed to evaporate entirely. She was no longer merely the fragile, unremarkable girl the village had laughed at. She had become something far more dangerous in their eyes, a cautionary tale of ambition and deceit, whispered about with a mixture of scorn and satisfaction that felt, in its own way, crueler than any laughter she had endured before. She spent long hours alone, poring over her memory of every ledger page she had examined, every document she had signed in the ordinary course of her work, searching desperately for any explanation of how a forged signature bearing her name had come to exist at all. It was during one such evening, staring blankly at her father's old ledger for comfort rather than purpose, that she finally remembered something significant. Weeks earlier, during her very first days at Ashworth Hall, she had signed a simple receipt acknowledging delivery of a batch of older ledgers from the estate's archive, a routine document of no particular consequence at the time. Edmund had been present when she signed it, had in fact been the one to hand her the pen. If he had kept that original receipt, studied her signature carefully, and practiced reproducing it before crafting his forged transfer document, the timeline would explain everything. It was not proof, not yet, but it was a thread worth pulling, and Eliza found herself, despite her fear and isolation, unable to simply surrender to Edmund's scheme without a fight. She wrote to Nathaniel that same night, carefully outlining her theory, and requesting that he locate the original receipt among the estate's archive records, hopeful that comparing the two signatures side by side might reveal enough similarity in construction to suggest deliberate copying rather than coincidence. His reply arrived 2 days later, brief and formal in a manner that stung more than she expected. I have located the receipt you described and shall present it to my solicitor for proper examination ahead of the hearing. I trust this matter will be resolved satisfactorily in due course. There was no warmth in the words, none of the easy familiarity that had grown between them over their weeks of shared work. Eliza told herself this was simply prudence, the careful distance he had promised to maintain until the accusation cleared, but a small, doubting part of her wondered whether Edmund's campaign of whispers had succeeded, at least partially, in planting seeds of uncertainty even within Nathaniel's own steady convictions. One afternoon, desperate for fresh air after days spent shut inside poring over her memories and papers, Eliza walked to the small churchyard at the edge of the village, seeking the quiet solitude of her father's grave. She had not expected to find Edmund Caro waiting there, seated calmly upon a low stone wall as though he had known precisely where and when to find her. Miss Marchmont, he said pleasantly, rising as she approached, though she made no move to come closer. I had hoped we might speak plainly, without an audience to complicate matters. I have nothing to say to you, Eliza replied, her voice steadier than she felt. No? I rather think you do. Edmund's pleasant tone did not waver, though something colder moved behind his eyes. You are a clever woman, cleverer than most in this county have given you credit for. I imagine you have already guessed how that receipt came to bear your signature. You forged it, Eliza said flatly. refusing to soften the accusation even standing alone with him in the empty churchyard. You studied my hand from a document I signed innocently in your presence, and used it to fabricate evidence of a crime I did not commit. Edmund did not deny it, which somehow frightened her more than an outright denial would have. You have a talent for numbers, Miss Marchmont, one I confess I did not anticipate when my cousin first brought you into this affair, but talent alone will not save you before a magistrate who has already heard, from several respectable sources, of your sudden and rather suspicious closeness to a wealthy, vulnerable landowner. The magistrate will examine the evidence honestly, Eliza said, though a cold thread of doubt had already begun working its way through her resolve. Perhaps, Edmund said, stepping closer, his voice dropping lower. Or perhaps he will see exactly what I intend for him to see, a scheming young woman who took advantage of a grieving, desperate man's trust for her own gain. I would advise you, quite sincerely, to withdraw yourself from this matter entirely before the hearing. Return to your farm, your ledgers, your quiet obscurity. Nathaniel will recover from this disappointment in time. You, I fear, will not recover so easily from what follows should you choose to remain. Eliza held his gaze despite the fear tightening in her chest. You are asking me to abandon the truth simply because you have grown skilled at burying it. I am offering you a chance to walk away with what little remains of your reputation intact, Edmund said. Consider it carefully, Miss Marchmont. Not everyone is fortunate enough to be offered such a choice before the consequences arrive. He left her standing alone among the gravestones, her hands trembling with a mixture of fury and fear she had rarely experienced so intensely in her life. She did not withdraw from the matter, though his threat lingered with her for the remainder of that long, difficult week, a constant shadow at the edge of every thought. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and as the days passed, Eliza found herself growing increasingly convinced that she would face the magistrate entirely alone, without allies, without reputation, and quite possibly without any hope of clearing her name against a man with far greater resources and standing than she could ever hope to match. 2 nights before the hearing, she was startled by an urgent knock at her aunt's door well past the hour when respectable visitors typically called. She opened it cautiously to find not Nathaniel, but a young stable hand from Ashworth Hall, breathless from what appeared to be a considerable run. Miss Marchmont, he gasped, you must come at once. There has been an accident involving Mr. Caro's carriage on the North Road, and Mr. Ashworth insists you be brought to the hall immediately. He says it concerns the hearing directly, and that time is short. Eliza's heart pounded as she gathered her cloak, uncertain whether this sudden summons represented salvation or yet another trap laid carefully in her path. She thought of the shadowed figure she had glimpsed weeks earlier along the very same lane, of Edmund's cold, calculating glance as he left the study with his forged documents in hand, and she hesitated only a moment before following the stable hand out into the dark, unwilling, despite every reasonable fear, to abandon the fight for her own name and future, without first learning exactly what awaited her at the end of that road. The stable hand led Eliza not toward any accident scene, but straight to the front doors of Ashworth Hall, where Nathaniel stood waiting on the steps, his face lit with an urgency she had not seen since the night he first appeared at her garden fence. There was no accident, he said quickly, before she could ask. I apologize for the deception, but I needed you here tonight without word reaching Edmund of your arrival, and a false urgency seemed the safest way to accomplish that. Come inside. I have found something you must see. He led her not to the small study where they had spent so many hours together, but to a locked room adjoining the estate's archive, one Eliza had never been permitted access to during her weeks of investigation. My father's private correspondence, Nathaniel explained, unlocking the door with a key he produced from his coat. I had forgotten it existed until yesterday, when I finally forced myself to search through everything Edmund might have overlooked or considered unimportant. Inside, stacks of letters and personal papers filled several trunks, untouched apparently for years. Nathaniel had already begun sorting through them, and he handed Eliza a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Read these, he said. I believe you will understand immediately why I summoned you so urgently. The letters, written some 4 years earlier between Nathaniel's late father and a solicitor in a neighboring county, revealed a troubling pattern that predated even Eliza's discoveries. Nathaniel's father had grown suspicious of certain irregularities in Edmund's management, had in fact commissioned a private inquiry shortly before his sudden death, an inquiry that appeared to have been abandoned entirely once he passed away, its findings apparently never delivered, or perhaps deliberately intercepted. Your father suspected him years ago, Eliza said, reading through the correspondence with growing astonishment, and died before he could act upon those suspicions, Nathaniel said grimly. I have always believed my father's death was simply the natural consequence of a weak heart, but reading these letters now, I confess I find myself wondering whether Edmund's fear of exposure played any role in the timing of that unfortunate event. Eliza set the letters down carefully, her mind racing through the implications. We cannot make such an accusation without proof, however suspicious the timing appears. But this correspondence alone changes everything regarding the forged transfer document. If we can locate the solicitor mentioned here, and if his original inquiry still exists in any form, we may find exactly the evidence needed to expose Edmund's pattern of deception as something far older and more calculated than a single desperate forgery. I sent a rider to that solicitor's office the moment I found these letters, Nathaniel said. He should return by morning with whatever answer can be found. They spent the remainder of that night together in the small study, reviewing every remaining document, building a timeline that stretched back years rather than weeks, tracing the slow, patient theft that had drained the estate gradually enough to avoid easy detection, while enriching Edmund steadily in the shadow of his cousin's trust. Near dawn, exhausted and bleary-eyed, Eliza finally allowed herself to voice the fear that had haunted her since Edmund's visit to the churchyard. "He threatened me," she admitted quietly. "Days ago, at my father's grave, he suggested I withdraw from this matter entirely, or face consequences beyond what I could recover from." Nathaniel's expression darkened immediately. "You did not tell me this." "I did not wish to give him the satisfaction of seeing how deeply his threat frightened me," Eliza said. "And I feared, foolishly perhaps, that telling you might only add further danger to a situation already dangerous enough." "Eliza," Nathaniel's voice softened, and he moved closer, taking her hands gently in his own, an intimacy neither of them had previously allowed themselves, despite the growing feeling that had built steadily between them across their weeks of shared work. "You must promise me you will not face threats such as this alone again. Whatever consequence Edmund intends for you, he shall have to answer to me first." Eliza looked up at him, exhaustion and fear giving way suddenly to something warmer and more vulnerable than she had permitted herself to feel in longer than she could remember. "I have spent my whole life managing difficulties alone, Nathaniel. It is not so easily unlearned, even now." "Then let this be the beginning of learning otherwise," he said quietly, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, the small study around them silent and still, the weight of everything unspoken between them finally beginning to settle into something neither could deny any longer. The rider returned just after dawn, bearing news that changed everything. The solicitor's office, though the original solicitor had since passed away, retained careful records of every inquiry ever commissioned through their practice, including the abandoned investigation into Edmund Caro's management of Ashworth Hall's accounts. The surviving partner, upon learning of Nathaniel's renewed interest, had agreed to appear personally at the hearing, bringing with him the original findings his predecessor had gathered before Nathaniel's father's sudden death interrupted the inquiry entirely. In the days remaining before the hearing, Nathaniel insisted Eliza remain at Ashworth Hall under the watchful protection of his household staff, unwilling to risk Edmund making good on whatever threat had prompted his churchyard warning. Eliza resisted the arrangement at first, mindful of her reputation and the gossip such a decision would inevitably invite. But Nathaniel's quiet insistence, coupled with her own genuine unease, eventually won out. "Propriety matters less to me now than your safety," he told her simply, arranging for a respectable older housekeeper to remain within calling distance at all times, a compromise that satisfied both his concern and the barest minimum of expectation the county might still demand. During those final days, Eliza and the estate's solicitor worked long hours preparing every document, every testimony, every careful comparison needed to dismantle Edmund's forged evidence beyond any reasonable doubt. She rehearsed her own account of events repeatedly, anticipating every possible challenge the magistrate or Edmund's own representation might raise against her. Nathaniel, for his part, spent those same days quietly visiting each tenant farmer who had suffered under Edmund's scheme, personally assuring them that whatever the hearing's outcome, their losses would be made right, and that no retribution would fall upon any of them for speaking truthfully about what had occurred. It was, Eliza thought privately, watching him depart each morning with quiet, determined purpose, a side of him the county had rarely glimpsed beneath his usual composed and distant manner, a man genuinely troubled by the suffering his negligence had allowed to continue unchecked for so long. "You did not create Edmund's greed," she told him one evening, finding him staring into the study fire long after the household had retired. "You cannot hold yourself responsible for failing to see what he worked so carefully to hide." "Perhaps not," Nathaniel said quietly, "but I allowed comfort and convenience to excuse my own inattention for far too long. I shall not make that mistake again, whatever the hearing's outcome. This estate, and everyone who depends upon it, deserves better vigilance than I have shown these past years. Eliza settled into the chair beside him, and for a long while neither spoke, content simply to share the quiet warmth of the fire and the steady, comfortable silence that had grown between them, so different from the careful formality of their earliest days together. The hearing, when it finally arrived, drew a crowd far larger than either Eliza or Nathaniel had anticipated, curiosity about the scandal having spread well beyond the village into the wider county. Eliza stood before the magistrate with her chin held high despite the churning fear in her stomach, acutely aware of every whispered comment rippling through the assembled onlookers behind her. Edmund arrived confident and composed, clearly believing his forged evidence sufficient to secure whatever outcome he desired. He offered his account first, painting Eliza as a scheming opportunist who had exploited his cousin's desperation for her own gain, his voice smooth and convincing enough that Eliza saw several faces in the crowd nodding along with obvious sympathy for his version of events. When her turn came to speak, Eliza felt the familiar tightness rise in her chest, the old weakness threatening to overwhelm her exactly as it always had in crowded, judgmental rooms. She thought, briefly, of the assembly hall months earlier, of shattered glass and cruel laughter, and steadied herself with the memory of every ledger she had balanced since, every quiet victory nobody had witnessed but herself. "I did not sign that document," she said clearly, her voice carrying further than she expected across the crowded room. "I would ask the magistrate to compare it directly against my genuine signature, present on numerous other papers throughout this estate's records, and to note the subtle but consistent differences any careful examination will reveal." The magistrate, an elderly man with sharp, careful eyes, agreed to the comparison, and Eliza watched with held breath as he studied the documents side by side under close light, murmuring quietly to his clerk throughout the examination. It was at this moment that Nathaniel's solicitor rose, presenting the surviving partner's findings from years earlier, along with the correspondence discovered in Nathaniel's father's private papers. The revelation that suspicions against Edmund predated Eliza's involvement by years shifted the mood of the room immediately, murmurs of surprise rippling through the crowd as the true scope of Edmund's deception began to unfold before them. Edmund's composed confidence finally cracked as the evidence mounted against him. He attempted to argue that the earlier inquiry had found nothing conclusive, that suspicion alone proved nothing, but his voice had lost the smooth certainty it carried at the hearing's opening, and the crowd's sympathy shifted visibly away from him with each passing minute. The final blow came when the tenant farmers Eliza had visited weeks earlier stepped forward, having been quietly summoned by Nathaniel's solicitor to offer testimony regarding their own payments and the discrepancies recorded against them. Godwin spoke plainly and firmly of his full payment and the receipt bearing his own mark. Marjorie Colt spoke, her voice trembling but resolute, of her son's sold pocket watch and the debt that had already been settled in full before that sacrifice was ever demanded of them. Even old Aldous Fenn, who had once shrugged at the idea of speaking against a gentleman's word, found the courage to confirm the pattern that had quietly robbed him for years. By the time the final testimony concluded, the magistrate required little additional persuasion. He ruled decisively that the transfer document bearing Eliza's supposed signature was indeed a forgery, constructed with clear intent to deflect suspicion from the estate's true financial irregularities onto an innocent party. He further ordered a full and formal investigation into Edmund Caro's management of Ashworth Hall's accounts, with the earlier suspicions and correspondence entered as compelling grounds for that investigation to proceed with the utmost seriousness. Edmund was escorted from the hearing under close watch, his composed mask finally abandoned entirely, replaced by a bitter, furious expression as he passed close by Eliza on his way out. "This is not finished," he muttered, low enough that only she could hear it. "You have made an enemy today, Miss Marchmont, one with more patience than you might imagine." Eliza did not flinch, though a cold thread of unease passed through her at his words. "Then I shall face whatever comes with the same patience I have always relied upon, Mr. Caro. I find it has served me rather well thus far." He said nothing further, allowed himself to be led away by the constable, and Eliza finally permitted herself to exhale fully, for what felt like the first time in weeks. The crowd that had gathered for the hearing lingered afterward, and Eliza found herself, for once, at the center of attention not through mockery, but through something closer to genuine respect. Several of the same women who had once laughed at her fainting spells now approached her with careful, almost apologetic congratulations, praising her cleverness and courage in terms that felt, after everything she had endured, both deeply satisfying and strangely hollow. She found Nathaniel waiting for her once the crowd had thinned, his expression carrying none of the careful distance he had maintained since the accusation first arose. "You were magnificent," he said simply. "I do not know how to properly thank you for what you have endured these past weeks on behalf of an estate and a family that had no right to demand such sacrifice from you." "I did not do it merely for your estate, Nathaniel," Eliza said quietly, the crowd around them fading into irrelevance as she finally allowed herself to speak the truth she had guarded so carefully throughout their difficult weeks together. "I did it because somewhere along the way, this became about more than numbers and ledgers to me. It became about proving, if only to myself, that I was capable of more than the world had ever allowed me to believe." "You have proven that beyond any doubt," Nathaniel said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into something far more intimate than the formal tones he had used throughout their public dealings. "Eliza, I find I can no longer pretend this matter concerns only my estate's finances. You have become, over these difficult weeks, someone whose presence I find I can no longer easily imagine my life without." Eliza's breath caught, old fears rising instinctively, even as her heart raced with a hope she had scarcely allowed herself to consider. "Nathaniel, you must consider carefully what such words mean, given everything that separates our stations in life. I am a farmer's daughter with a weak constitution, and no fortune to speak of. The county will not easily forgive you for choosing someone such as me, regardless of what has occurred here today." "The county laughed at you for weakness it never troubled itself to understand," Nathaniel said firmly, "and it very nearly allowed a genuine criminal to destroy both our futures through nothing more than convincing lies and careless assumption. I find I care a great deal less for the county's approval than I once believed I did, Eliza. I care considerably more for the truth of what I have come to feel these past weeks, watching you fight for justice with more courage than most men of my acquaintance could ever hope to summon." Eliza looked up at him. The churchyard threat, the whispered gossip, the years of quiet loneliness all suddenly feeling distant and insignificant against the steady warmth in his eyes. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "it is time we both stopped caring quite so much what the county believes, and started paying closer attention to what we ourselves have come to know as true." Nathaniel smiled, the first fully unguarded smile she had seen from him since this entire ordeal began, and reached for her hand once more, this time without any pretense of formality or careful distance between them. They walked together toward his waiting carriage, and Eliza noticed, almost distantly, that the whispers following them now carried a different tone entirely than the cruel murmurs of the assembly hall so many weeks earlier. Curiosity remained, certainly, and a few sharp glances of lingering doubt among the county's most stubborn gossips, but beneath it all ran something new, something closer to grudging admiration for a woman who had faced ruin and emerged, against every expectation placed upon her, standing taller than before. As the carriage pulled away from the courthouse, Eliza allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to simply breathe without the weight of dread pressing against her chest. She thought of her father, of the promise she had made him so many years ago to guard her gift carefully, in a world unlikely to forgive a woman for possessing it. She wondered, watching Nathaniel's steady profile beside her in the fading afternoon light, whether he might have been wrong after all, or whether the world itself had simply needed the right man willing to see past its narrow expectations, to finally offer her the forgiveness he had feared she would never receive. "What will become of Edmund now?" she asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "The formal investigation will determine the full extent of what he has taken," Nathaniel said. "Given the years involved and the deliberate nature of his forgery, I expect the consequences will prove severe. He will certainly never hold position or trust within this county again, whatever the magistrate ultimately decides regarding more formal punishment." "And the estate itself?" Eliza asked. "What remains to be done, now that the truth has finally come to light?" Nathaniel turned to look at her fully then, something warm and hopeful lighting his tired features. "A great deal remains to be done, Eliza. Accounts to be properly restored, tenants to be made whole, systems to be rebuilt, so that no single man might ever again exploit this estate's trust so thoroughly. I find myself in need of someone with precisely your particular talents to help guide that rebuilding, should she be willing to consider a more permanent arrangement than she has allowed herself to imagine thus far." Eliza felt her heart quicken at the careful weight behind his words, understanding clearly that he spoke of far more than any formal position or title. "I have never been very good at imagining arrangements beyond what practicality demands," she admitted softly. "But I find, rather to my own surprise, that I am becoming considerably more willing to try." The formal investigation into Edmund Caro's affairs concluded within a month, revealing a scheme far more extensive than even Eliza had initially uncovered. Beyond the diverted rents from tenant farmers, investigators discovered falsified invoices for repairs never completed, inflated wages for laborers who did not exist, and a slow, methodical draining of funds that had continued unchecked for nearly 6 years. The final sum recovered from accounts Edmund had quietly established under false names exceeded even Nathaniel's worst estimates, though it fell considerably short of what had actually been stolen, much of it already spent on a lifestyle far grander than his modest position should have allowed. Edmund was formally stripped of any remaining claim upon the Ashworth family's trust or property, and though the full weight of legal consequence took many months to resolve through the courts, he departed the county entirely within weeks of the hearing, never to be seen in that part of the world again. Eliza felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that the truth had finally prevailed, and that the honest farmers who had suffered under his greed would at last see their losses restored. Nathaniel kept his promise to every tenant affected by the scheme, personally overseeing the restoration of every improperly collected shilling, along with a fair measure of additional compensation for the hardship each family had endured. Marjorie Colt received not only her rightful due but a small additional sum specifically earmarked for the return of her son's sacrificed pocket watch, a gesture that brought the proud widow to tears when Nathaniel delivered the news himself. "You did not need to trouble yourself with such details personally," Eliza observed one afternoon, watching him review the final compensation records with the same careful attention he now brought to every aspect of the estate's management. "I find I care rather more about the details now than I once did," Nathaniel replied, setting down his pen to look at her properly. "A lesson I owe entirely to a woman who taught me that numbers on a page represent real lives, real sacrifices, and deserve to be treated with far more respect than I once afforded them." The village, meanwhile, found itself thoroughly reshaping its opinion of Eliza Marchmont in the weeks following the hearing. The same women who had once whispered cruelly behind gloved hands now sought her out with careful, sometimes transparently self-interested friendliness, eager to claim some connection to the woman who had exposed a years-long fraud and, according to the rapidly spreading rumors, captured the heart of the county's wealthiest landowner in the process. Eliza met this sudden reversal with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout every earlier humiliation, neither seeking to punish those who had mocked her, nor pretending the years of cruelty had never happened. She simply continued her work, now formally established as Ashworth Hall's steward of accounts, a position unprecedented for a woman in that county but one Nathaniel had insisted upon publicly and without apology, regardless of whatever objection the more traditional families might quietly harbor. Beyond the estate's financial recovery, Eliza found herself increasingly drawn into broader responsibilities she had never anticipated when she first agreed to examine Nathaniel's ledgers. Tenant families, having witnessed her diligence firsthand, began approaching her directly with concerns about their leases, their harvests, and the small disputes that inevitably arose across so vast a property. She listened to each with the same careful attention she gave to any column of figures, and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she possessed a natural gift for resolving such matters fairly, weighing each side's concerns with patience and clear judgment, rather than the careless dismissal many tenants had grown accustomed to under Edmund's neglectful oversight. Nathaniel encouraged this expanding role without hesitation, often deferring to her judgment on matters he once would have handled entirely alone. "You understand these people's lives in a way I confess I never fully did," he told her one afternoon, watching her patiently explain a new payment schedule to an anxious young tenant struggling after a difficult season. "I inherited this estate. You have earned every measure of trust it now holds in you." Her days grew fuller than she had ever imagined possible, split between the careful work of accounts, the growing responsibilities of tenant welfare, and the countless small preparations required before a wedding of such prominent standing. Yet amid all this activity, she found herself happier and more settled than she had believed herself capable of becoming. The constant, low anxiety that had shadowed her since childhood, gradually easing in the steady warmth of purpose and genuine partnership. She wrote occasionally to distant relations who had shown little interest in her during the lean years following her father's death, informing them plainly of her engagement without any particular expectation of their response. Most replied with sudden, transparent enthusiasm, eager now to claim closer kinship with a woman about to become mistress of one of the county's grandest estates. Eliza accepted their belated warmth with quiet amusement rather than resentment, understanding well enough by now how quickly fortune could reshape the affections of those who had once found her entirely unremarkable. It was at the county's annual harvest assembly, held some 3 months after the hearing's conclusion, that Eliza found herself once again standing in the very same hall where she had once dropped a tray of glasses to a chorus of cruel laughter. She had considered declining the invitation entirely, wary of returning to a place so heavily associated with her earlier humiliation, but Nathaniel had gently encouraged her to attend, promising to remain at her side throughout the evening should the memory prove difficult to bear. The hall looked much as it had months earlier, the same crystal chandeliers, the same polished floors, the same assembled families of the county's gentry gathered in their finest evening wear. Eliza felt the old, familiar tightness begin to rise in her chest as she entered, the memory of that earlier humiliation pressing insistently against her composure. "You need not stay if it proves too difficult," Nathaniel murmured, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, a quiet, steadying presence amid the swirl of curious glances following their entrance. "I have spent too many years avoiding rooms that made me uncomfortable," Eliza replied, drawing a steadying breath. "I find I would rather face this one directly, particularly with you beside me." They moved through the gathering together, and Eliza noticed immediately how different the reception felt from her memory of months earlier. Where once she had been ignored or openly mocked, she now found herself greeted with careful, sometimes awkward politeness. Several families clearly uncertain how to properly address a woman who had risen so dramatically in both reputation and apparent prospects since they had last paid her any serious attention. It was near the evening's midpoint, during a brief lull in the music, that Nathaniel drew her gently toward the center of the room, a request for the assembly's attention following shortly after. Eliza felt a flush of uncertain anticipation as every eye in the hall turned toward them, an echo of that earlier humiliating moment, now transformed into something else entirely. "Many of you gathered in this hall some months ago," Nathaniel began, his voice carrying clearly across the quieted room, "and witnessed an unfortunate moment involving Miss Eliza Marchmont, a moment some among you found cause for laughter rather than compassion." Eliza felt her cheeks warm, uncertain where this public address intended to lead, though she trusted Nathaniel enough to remain steady beside him. "What none of you knew then," Nathaniel continued, "was that the same woman you dismissed as fragile and unremarkable possessed a mind sharper than any accountant I have ever employed, a mind that uncovered years of careful fraud within my own estate's accounts, and, in doing so, saved not only my family's fortune, but the livelihoods of a dozen tenant families who had suffered silently under that deception for far too long." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd, and Eliza caught sight of the same women who had laughed so cruelly months earlier, their faces now carrying expressions of visible discomfort at the public reminder of their earlier unkindness. "I owe Miss Marchmont a debt I can never fully repay," Nathaniel continued, turning to face her directly now, his voice softening though it remained clear enough to carry across the silent hall. "And I find myself unwilling to wait any longer to make known, before every family gathered in this room, exactly how deeply I have come to value her presence in my life, not merely as the woman who saved my estate, but as the woman I hope will agree to share the whole of my future." He reached into his coat and produced a small ring, dropping to one knee before her with a confidence and warmth that erased entirely the careful, guarded man who had first appeared at her garden fence months earlier. "Eliza Marchmont," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment and the many watching eyes surrounding them, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The hall fell utterly silent, every guest holding their breath as Eliza stood before him, tears gathering unbidden in her eyes as the full weight of the moment settled over her. She thought, briefly, of every laugh she had endured within these very walls, every whispered cruelty, every lonely evening spent believing herself destined for nothing more than quiet obscurity. "Yes," she said finally, her voice breaking with emotion she no longer wished to hide. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will." The hall erupted into applause, some genuine, some perhaps still tinged with lingering disbelief at how thoroughly the county's judgment of Eliza Marchmont had been proven wrong, but applause nonetheless, warm and sustained, as Nathaniel rose and drew her into an embrace that felt, after everything they had endured together, entirely and completely earned. In the weeks that followed, the engagement became the county's chief topic of conversation, displacing even the lingering scandal of Edmund's fraud as the primary subject of every dinner party and market conversation. Eliza found herself, somewhat to her own amusement, transformed almost overnight from an object of quiet mockery into a figure of considerable local fascination, invited to gatherings she would once never have dreamed of attending, consulted on matters of estate management by families who had previously never thought to ask her opinion on anything at all. She approached this sudden transformation with the same careful composure she had always relied upon, neither allowing it to inflate her sense of self, nor permitting old insecurities to diminish the genuine pride she now felt in her own accomplishments. She continued her work managing Ashworth Hall's accounts even as wedding preparations advanced, unwilling to abandon the role that had given her such purpose, and Nathaniel, true to every promise he had made her, never once suggested she should. The days leading up to the wedding brought their own quiet challenges, as Eliza navigated the unfamiliar world of formal engagements, wedding preparations, and the careful expectations placed upon a future estate mistress. She found herself grateful, more than once, for Nathaniel's patient guidance through customs and traditions she had never expected to encounter in her own life, and equally grateful that he never once made her feel foolish for her unfamiliarity with the finer points of gentry etiquette. "You need not master every tradition overnight," he told her gently one evening, after she had grown visibly frustrated attempting to memorize the proper order of introductions expected at their upcoming wedding breakfast. "You have already mastered far harder things than seating arrangements and formal greetings. The rest will come with time, and where it does not, I care little enough for tradition that we shall simply create our own." Eliza laughed at that, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "I imagine your mother's generation would be scandalized to hear the future master of Ashworth Hall speak so carelessly of tradition." "My mother's generation laughed at a fainting girl in an assembly hall and called it entertainment," Nathaniel replied, his tone turning gently serious. "I find I trust my own judgment, and yours, rather more than I trust customs that reward cruelty and punish honest weakness." Such moments, quiet and unremarkable to any outside observer, became precious to Eliza in the weeks before her wedding, small proofs that the man she had agreed to marry valued her genuine self far more than any polished performance of proper gentility she might have struggled to provide. Her Aunt Margaret, initially overwhelmed by the sudden change in her niece's prospects, eventually settled into quiet, tearful pride, watching Eliza prepare for a future neither of them could have imagined during those long, uncertain years following her father's death. "He sees you clearly," Margaret told her one evening, helping to fit the wedding dress that had arrived from London some weeks prior. "Not the frailty the village always saw, nor even simply the clever mind you kept so carefully hidden all these years. He sees the whole of you, Eliza, and loves what he finds there. That is a rarer gift than any fortune or title could ever provide." Eliza thought often, in the quiet moments before her wedding, of her father, of the ledger she still kept carefully preserved, of the promise she had made him so many years earlier to guard her gift in a world unlikely to forgive her for possessing it. She understood now, with a clarity she had not possessed before Nathaniel entered her life, that her father's warning had been born of his own limited experience, of a world he had known that offered little patience for women who thought too clearly or worked too diligently at tasks reserved for men. That world, she had discovered, was not so fixed and unchangeable as either of them had once believed. It required only the right person, willing to look past narrow expectation toward genuine worth, to prove that even the most quietly dismissed among them might yet find recognition, respect, and love in equal, generous measure. The wedding itself, held on a bright autumn morning some months after Nathaniel's public proposal, drew nearly the entire county to Ashworth Hall's grounds, the same grounds Eliza had first glimpsed as a wary, uncertain visitor, with nothing but her father's worn ledger clutched against her chest. She walked toward Nathaniel that morning not as the frail, unremarkable girl the county had once dismissed, but as a woman fully certain of her own worth, surrounded by tenant families she had personally helped restore to fairness, and by a man who had never once, throughout their entire acquaintance, asked her to become anything other than exactly who she already was. As the ceremony concluded and the assembled guests offered their congratulations, Eliza caught sight of the very same women who had laughed at her fainting spell so many months earlier, now offering warm, seemingly genuine well-wishes among the celebrating crowd. She accepted their congratulations graciously, harboring no lingering bitterness toward people who had simply never troubled themselves to look closely enough to see her clearly. She had, after all, learned something valuable through every difficult moment of the preceding months, something she intended to carry with her throughout the whole of her new life as mistress of Ashworth Hall. Strength did not always announce itself through confidence or social grace. Sometimes it lived quietly within a person, patient and unremarked upon, waiting only for the right circumstance and the right person willing to look closely enough to finally reveal itself in its fullest, truest measure. 5 years passed before Eliza Ashworth found herself once again standing in the great hall where her life had so completely changed, though this time she stood not as a guest but as its mistress, watching over preparations for the county's harvest assembly with the calm authority of a woman fully settled into her role. Ashworth Hall looked nothing like the fading, neglected estate Eliza had first walked into, as a wary young woman clutching her father's ledger. The ivy that had once crept destructively up the west wing had been carefully cleared and replanted along a proper trellis, the cracked stonework repaired and restored. The shuttered windows had long since been reopened, filling the once dim corridors with abundant light, a fitting symbol, Eliza often thought, of everything that had changed since the truth first came to light within these walls. The estate's finances, once crippled by years of quiet theft, now flourished under a system of careful oversight that Eliza herself had designed and implemented, one that ensured no single steward, however trusted, could ever again drain the estate's resources unchecked. Every tenant farm operated under fair, transparent agreements, reviewed regularly and adjusted honestly according to genuine hardship rather than any collector's convenient discretion. Marjorie Colt's eldest son now served as one of the estate's most trusted collection agents, a position Eliza had personally recommended, trusting the young man's own painful experience with dishonest management to make him particularly vigilant against any repetition of Edmund's old schemes. Eliza and Nathaniel's marriage had settled, over the years, into a steady, comfortable partnership built upon the same foundation of mutual respect that had first drawn them together during those difficult weeks of investigation. They had welcomed 2 children into the world, a daughter with her father's steady gray eyes, and a son who had already, at the tender age of 3, shown a curious fascination with the small wooden counting blocks his mother kept in the nursery, much to Eliza's quiet, private delight. "He shall have your mind for figures," Nathaniel observed one evening, watching their son carefully stack the blocks into neat, deliberate rows, rather than scattering them carelessly as most children his age preferred. "Though I confess I hope he inherits rather less of your stubborn insistence on solving every problem entirely alone before accepting help." "I have learned to accept help rather better than I once did," Eliza replied, settling beside him with the quiet ease of long familiarity. "You have proven a patient teacher in that particular lesson." Their daughter, meanwhile, had inherited her mother's quiet watchfulness alongside a confidence Eliza herself had never possessed at that age. A confidence born, Eliza often reflected, from growing up in a household where her mother's intelligence was celebrated rather than hidden, where she witnessed daily proof that a woman's mind could shape the fortunes of an entire estate without apology or concealment. The village, too, had changed considerably in the years since the hearing that first exposed Edmund Caro's fraud. Word of Eliza's role in uncovering the deception, and her subsequent success managing Ashworth Hall's recovery, had traveled well beyond the county's borders, drawing occasional visits from other landowners curious to consult with the woman who had transformed a failing estate into one of the most soundly managed properties in the region. Eliza found genuine satisfaction in these consultations, offering practical guidance drawn from hard-won experience to other families facing similar troubles, though she never accepted payment for such advice, preferring instead to think of it as a debt repaid to every honest tenant who had once suffered silently under dishonest management. Edmund Caro, she had learned through occasional distant correspondence, had eventually settled in a distant county under considerably reduced circumstances, his reputation too thoroughly damaged to secure any position of trust or standing ever again. Eliza felt no particular satisfaction in his continued misfortune, only a settled certainty that justice, however delayed, had ultimately found its proper measure. Her Aunt Margaret had lived to see both grandchildren born, before passing peacefully in her sleep some 2 years after the wedding, content in the knowledge that the niece she had raised through years of uncertainty and quiet struggle had found a future far brighter than either of them had once dared imagine. Eliza kept her aunt's favorite chair in a place of honor within the family sitting room, a small, constant reminder of the woman who had raised her with patience and care despite the many worries Eliza's fragile health and unconventional habits had caused throughout her childhood. Beyond the estate itself, Eliza had, in recent years, begun quietly mentoring several young women from struggling families across the county, teaching them the same careful skills with figures and accounts her own father had once taught her in secret. She insisted on no secrecy for her own pupils, however, holding her lessons openly in a small room set aside within the estate's east wing, determined that no other clever, capable girl should ever need to hide her gifts the way she once had. One such pupil, a shy, quick-minded girl named Charlotte Bray, had shown particular promise, mastering complex calculations within months that had taken Eliza years to fully understand on her own. Watching Charlotte work through a difficult column of figures one afternoon, brow furrowed in fierce concentration, Eliza felt a swell of pride entirely separate from anything she had experienced in her own accomplishments, a satisfaction rooted in knowing that the path she had carved through such difficulty now stood open and welcoming for others who might otherwise have walked it entirely alone. "You make it look simple," Charlotte said one afternoon, frustration creeping into her young voice after a particularly stubborn error in her calculations. "It was never simple for me either," Eliza told her gently. "I merely learned, through many long nights and many mistakes, that patience mattered more than natural talent, and that the numbers would always eventually reveal their truth to anyone willing to look closely enough and long enough to find it." Nathaniel, for his part, had grown into his role as estate master with a thoroughness and genuine care that had earned him considerable respect throughout the county. Respect built not upon inherited wealth alone, but upon the visible fairness and diligence he now brought to every decision affecting those who depended upon Ashworth Hall for their livelihoods. He often credited Eliza openly for this transformation, never shying from acknowledging, in conversations with fellow landowners, precisely how much he owed to his wife's sharp mind and unwavering commitment to honesty. Their household, too, had grown to include a small staff of servants who had once worked under Edmund's neglectful oversight, each now treated with a fairness and consideration they had rarely experienced during those difficult years, a quiet testament to the kind of household Eliza and Nathaniel had determined together to build, one where no person's contribution, however modest their station, would ever again go unnoticed or unappreciated. On the evening of the harvest assembly, as guests began arriving in growing numbers, Eliza found a quiet moment to slip away to the small study where her work had first begun so many years earlier. The room had changed considerably since those early days, expanded and reorganized to accommodate the estate's growing prosperity, though she had insisted on keeping her father's original ledger displayed prominently upon a shelf near her own desk, a humble reminder amid the grandeur of everything that had followed. She ran her fingers gently across its worn cover, remembering the countless late nights spent poring over its careful columns, the promise she had made her father to guard her gift in a world unlikely to forgive her for possessing it. She thought, too, of the frightened, uncertain young woman who had once stood at a garden fence, torn between fear and hope as a desperate stranger asked for her help. That woman had been braver than she ever gave herself credit for at the time, Eliza reflected, though it had taken years of hard-won confidence to fully recognize the truth of it. Every quiet evening spent balancing her father's accounts, every humiliation endured within crowded assembly halls, every moment of careful, patient discipline had prepared her, without her ever fully realizing it, for the single greatest challenge and opportunity of her life. "There you are," Nathaniel said, appearing in the doorway with the same warm, familiar smile that had first begun to soften her carefully guarded heart all those years ago. "The guests are asking after their hostess." "I was simply remembering," Eliza said, closing the ledger gently and rising to join him. "How very different everything looks now from where it began." Nathaniel crossed the room and took her hand, his gaze drifting briefly to the worn ledger before returning to her face with unmistakable warmth. "I remember quite clearly myself. A frightened, brilliant woman standing at a garden fence, refusing to promise me anything beyond a willingness to look closely at the truth, however difficult it might prove." "And has it proven worthwhile?" Eliza asked softly, though she already knew his answer. "Every difficult moment of it," Nathaniel said, drawing her closer. "I have never once regretted seeking you out that evening, Eliza, nor any single day that followed since." Together they returned to the great hall, where warm firelight and cheerful conversation filled the space that had once witnessed her deepest humiliation, and later her greatest triumph. Eliza moved through the gathered crowd with quiet, settled confidence, greeting tenant families and county gentry alike with the same genuine warmth, no longer troubled by whispered judgment or careless mockery, for she had long since proven, beyond any doubt the county could ever again seriously entertain, that the frail, unremarkable girl they once dismissed so easily had possessed, all along, a strength far greater than any of them had ever bothered to look closely enough to see. As the evening wore on and the assembly's music swelled through the hall, Nathaniel drew her gently onto the dance floor, an activity Eliza had once dreaded above nearly all others, certain her weak constitution would fail her in full view of every judgmental eye in the county. She danced now without fear, her hand steady in her husband's, her breath calm and even, despite the crowded warm room around them, proof enough, if any were still needed, of exactly how far she had traveled from that trembling girl, who had once dropped a tray of glasses, and fled into the cold night certain she would always remain unseen and unwanted. She had not remained unseen. She had, in the end, been seen more clearly than she ever imagined possible, by a man willing to look past every narrow expectation the world had placed upon her, and by herself, finally, fully, without apology or doubt, exactly as she truly was.